Hi, everyone. I'm Corey Woods, Mayor of the City of Tempe, and thank you so much for attending today's summit. It's really important that we have these courageous conversations on race in the year 2020, and I'm just so excited that you all could join us today. I just wanted to first of all thank ASU, the City of Tempe, and Tech Data for sponsoring this forum, and I wanted to talk for a second about why race equity is so important from my perspective. The reality is I chose the City of Tempe 17 years ago to live because it had a reputation as a diverse, inclusive city that was welcoming to all. And even more importantly, our city government and the companies that actually located here in Tempe also viewed racial equity as a top priority. It's important to have people of all different backgrounds, whether it's in entry-level jobs, mid-level jobs, or C-suite jobs, because it's imperative that all perspectives of people of all different backgrounds and demographics are represented in these rooms. That's the only way we're truly going to be able to really move forward as a community and as a country. So I'm really excited about you being here today. This is a very important conversation, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cal Jackson, Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Tech Data Corporation. I want to thank Mayor Woodley for this opportunity to collaborate with the Arizona State University and the City of Tempe. This event is going to be phenomenal. You know, at Tech Data, we strive to be a very progressive organization. Inclusion is one of our core shared values. And in light of the national protests and the dialogue, we have had our own listening sessions and provided education around the Black experience. We've provided opportunities for our colleagues to learn more about their diverse workforce. And today, I'm so happy that you will be able to participate in another opportunity to create a safe space to have these courageous conversations.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Copell. I'm Dean of the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions at ASU. I'm delighted to welcome you to this important event on creating a roadmap to understanding. This is a terrific collaboration between ASU, City of Tempe, and Tech Data, and I'm delighted that you chose to take time to be part of it. I was asked to speak a little bit as an introduction to what we can do individually, because we think of this as these massive social challenges and how do I, as one person, make a difference? I think the most important thing you can do is actually to take a moment to examine your own role in this big system and your own behavior, and what biases, what lenses do you see something through? That's not about feeling guilty and beating yourself up. It's about understanding your place in the world as it operates and how little changes in the things that we do might actually have a big impact. We all know that this is not the more perfect union that our framers envisioned, but the whole point was that we would keep getting better. Well, it can't get better unless we each take some responsibility for our own role. And I'll say one thing, this event is about having tough conversations on race. I know that because it's right there above my head, tough conversations. And so one of the things that we need to do is to overcome our fear, our hesitation to talk about some of these topics, because there is a genuine risk that you'll get criticized, or you'll say the wrong thing, or you'll be a little awkward. And man, if we can't share our feelings and be honest about how we see things, boy, it's going to be really hard to make any progress. And at the same time, if our reaction to each other is to judge and assume the worst, and to cast aspersions on somebody's character because of how we hear what somebody says, it's hard to figure out how we're gonna make any progress at all. So my wish to you as you engage in this process is that you have the strength, the courage to overcome that feeling of trepidation about putting yourself out there, and also to look your fellow conversationalists in the face and project the best intentions that you can. And only if we all take that posture, both for ourselves and for others, can we not only craft a roadmap to understanding, but make progress towards a more just, more equitable community, which is what we're all here to pursue together.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for sponsoring this important toolkit. Now, let's begin. We are pleased to feature 3 guest speakers for today's session. Colleen Jennings Rogensock, arts leader and visionary, is Vice President for Cultural Affairs for Arizona State University and Executive Director of ASU Gamage. Colleen serves on the Broadway League's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, Government Relations Committee, the Executive Committee, and the Board of Governors, Labor Committee, and co-chairs the Road Presenters Intra-Industry Committee, and of course is Arizona's only Tony voter. Colleen is a founding and current member of the Creative Capital Board and senior advisor to Women of Color in the Arts, former Association of Performing Arts Professionals board president, and she served on the National Council of the Arts at the bequest of President Clinton and is a life director of the Fiesta Bowl. She is a consultant to universities, international governments, and a featured speaker at conferences. We're pleased to have her. As Cultural Relations Director, Kinja Hassan serves as a liaison between ASU and diverse communities throughout the Valley. During her time at ASU, Kinja has brought college preparation programs to American Indian youth on reservations. She's launched a series of reports on the status of Arizona's ethnic and racial minorities. And she orchestrated national dialogues on pressing issues in Washington, D.C. and other cities. Currently, Kinja serves on the Advocacy Committee of the YWCA and the African American Women's Giving and Empowerment Circle at the Arizona Community Foundation. She is an advisor to 2 undergraduate student organizations at ASU and started ASU's African and African American Faculty and Staff Association. Kinja holds a BA in Religion from Princeton University and a Master's in Religious Studies from Arizona State University, both with an emphasis on American Indian traditions. She is currently pursuing a PhD at ASU's College of Nursing and Health Innovation, focusing on health disparities in the African American community. We're honored to have her. Finally, Dr. James Wormers is a clinical assistant professor of humanities in the Languages and Cultures Unit in the College of Integrative Sciences and Arts at Arizona State University. Dr. Wormers writes about Shakespeare, pedagogy, and issues of race and democracy, often all at once. And he teaches courses in composition, film, gender studies, literature, philosophy, and religious studies. He also develops and leads innovative and engaging community programs like Words on Wheels. Welcome to Dr. Wormers. So welcome, Colleen. Thank you so much for getting us started today and kicking off our roadmap. We are so honored to have you join us today on these important topics. You know, one of the recurring questions that diversity practitioners have heard over and over recently is, how do we even begin to have a conversation about race and what's happening in our society today? You know, sometimes we think those conversations might be among just our family or our friends, but really conversations are happening in our neighborhoods and on our workplaces. And so I pose that question to you, Colleen. How we start this question and how we start this conversation truly determines the quality of discussion that follows. So, how do we start? How do we start talking about what we're seeing and hearing?
Janae, what a great question. And you're absolutely right. This is a question that everyone is asking themselves. And whether we are in the neighborhood, whether we are in the grocery store, whether we are in socially distanced church services or at work, how to talk about race. Well, the first thing I want to say is practice. Jawalila Zolar, who is a famous choreographer, said, "You do not show up to one dance class and all of a sudden you become a dancer. You don't. What you have to do is take class every single day, and you have to practice and practice and practice." And thus is the same thing about talking about race. We must get together and practice. One of the first most important things about discussing race is knowing that you're in a safe space, knowing that you have the right to be wrong. And that's part of being in a safe space. And the only way you're going to get good at it is if you fail in talking about it. So looking at a safe space. For those of us at work and in staff meetings and in group gatherings, race should be a part of every discussion. Equity, diversity, and inclusion, every discussion. And it doesn't matter if you're discussing how the plumbing is happening, or it doesn't matter if you're discussing how to seat musicians in a pit. There should always be a discussion about equity, diversity, inclusion, and about race. I think it's always wise for people to start out in just asking three very simple questions. Number one, how are you? How are you doing? How are you doing in this environment we are in? How are you doing in the fact that we are dealing with two pandemics? We're dealing with a pandemic virus with COVID-19, which we will find a virus for and pass, and we're dealing with a long-term pandemic of race in America, of race issues around the world. And that's not such an easy virus to have. So first of all, how are you doing in terms of the pandemic? Secondly, how is your community doing? And you may define your community however you will. Where you live, where you work, where you worship, where you gather with friends. How is your community doing in terms of race, in terms of equity, in terms of inclusion? And thirdly, what are you going to do about it? Because I think it's one thing to talk about race, but then to feel how you are actively involved. Now, many places have put out pledges saying, I will pledge this and I will pledge that. I think as you go forward in your discussion about race, you must think about a personal pledge, a personal code of conduct, so that as you understand race, as you understand equity, diversity, and inclusion, what will you as a person do to foster that, to foster the discussions, to make things happen? And so it doesn't have to be big things. It can be small things. We were just having a discussion about race with my staff at ASU Gamage, and our house manager said, well, I have a story. I was in managing the house. There was a play going on. It was Peter Pan, Finding Neverland. And I came out and there was a little girl in the lobby crying, and she'd been in the concession line. And a white man had said to her, you do not belong here. And my staff member, Marley's her name, and she's fabulous, took the little girl and said, not only do you belong here, let me show you who runs this organization. And she opened a program, and there was my picture. And she talked more with the little girl until the little girl felt better, helped her to get her concessions, and helped her back to her seat. And the little girl was Black. And that small moment, that tiny moment, changed not only the life of the little girl, but the life of Marley. And so in understanding, in discussing race and in discussing how things change, yes, there will be large sweeping changes, but you need to be responsible for the section that you're responsible for. And whether it is helping a little girl back to her seat and saying, yes, you do belong here, or whether it is marching, or whether it is passing legislation, that personal code of conduct that you own, that's yours, will help you to understand race better. Also, in starting discussions about race, it's often uncomfortable. Everyone has to get used to it being uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable, but sometimes it's hard to jumpstart discussions about race. So one of the things I recommend is that you gather around a thing. You gather around a video, a film, a book, an article that everyone has viewed. And you might view it together or read it together or view it separately and come together. I actually recommend that you view it together because number one, it means everyone has viewed it. And number two, you're going on a journey together. Some of those videos include Race in America by Holy Post, and you can look these up on your LinkedIn. I will also provide this information later. There's an interview that I conducted on behalf of the Broadway League that oversees Broadway and the Road with Tony Award-winning Kenny Leone. He has just recently, and he would have won the Tony this year for directing A Soldier's Story. He's an African-American director, but he directs films, television, and Broadway. And that's a really interesting video to watch. It is an hour in length, and there are some Q&As at the end, but Kenny's discussion about his journey, it is couched in a universality role. It's couched in everyone can relate to it, and yet it is still focused on the discussion of race. So that is something I would recommend. I would also recommend when your groups are looking at other things out there, Black Theater United has a really great speaker series that they've started with what I believe is the royalty of Broadway. Audra McDonald interviewed Cheryl Eifels, who is the president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and it was about the law and race. And then Viola Davis interviewed Stacey Abrams and her sister, Dr. Abrams Smith, on sociology and the sociological impact. All of these things become talking points so that you can begin to discuss what you had seen, and then out of that, discussions of individuals will come about. I would also recommend several books. One of the books which everyone has been reading is How to Be an Anti-Racist. And it is Kendi who wrote this book. Dr. Kendi wrote this book. And the notion is you are not a racist, but you are an anti-racist, and that there are action steps and discussions in that book. Also White Fragility, which is a book about how white people relate in terms of race. And I think it is okay to have discussion groups about that book monolithically. And then I know several discussion groups have happened across the country where white people get together and discuss race and discuss racism. And then it becomes a larger group discussion. I would also recommend Me and White Supremacy by Dr. Sant, which would be really great. And then I think also to have speakers. For those of you who are in offices and organizations and clubs, to invite someone to come and speak with you and jumpstart your conversation. I'm going to close by saying I think it is vitally important that we also use that personal code of conduct. This is what I will do. I'm going to read the book. This is what I will do. I will gain in a conversation. This is what I will do. I will make a point of speaking with someone that I don't know and that I have no relationship with and building one. So those are my thoughts of how we begin the discussion. And remember, discussing about race takes practice.
Colleen, thank you. Thank you for that wise advice. I love how you began that the roadmap begins with practice. It begins with dancing, and there's nothing more joyful than getting together and dancing on this road together. You gave us some key nuggets like the right to be wrong. And as you just stated, what is your personal code of conduct, your ability to have a tiny moment yourself that can have multiple changes in multiple lives. So thank you for that. And most importantly, we'll make sure we'll get all those resources listed out at the end of this toolkit, at the end of this roadmap. But yes, let's use books and interviews and guest speakers to jumpstart conversations. Thank you for that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kendra, thank you so much for joining us today and being a part of this important conversation, this important toolkit and resource for our community. You just heard from Colleen, and Colleen really dug into how do we even begin to have conversations on race. And of course, some of those conversations may be littered with terms that are new for some and not for others, but definitely words that we're hearing more recently. Let's take, for example, we've heard terms like white supremacy and implicit bias, white privilege, systemic racism. Those are big words if they've not been used in conversation before. So my question for you, Kendra, are these new terms? Where are they even from, and what do they mean?
Thanks, Janae. Thanks for asking, and thanks for putting this toolkit together. So some of these terms are new, and some of them are old, but they're all referring to aspects of human life, especially in the United States, that have been around for a very long time. And they're important because they help people decide how they're going to have a conversation about certain concepts. But let me pause for a second and remind everyone, again, we know that entering into dialogues about race is not easy. I grew up in biracial households, and I live in a biracial household now. And a lot of my friends are white, and I can tell you that some of my friends and family are ready to dig in and have conversations about race, and they're willing to do so with a little bit of discomfort, but knowing they're ready to get through it. And then there's other members of my family or other friends for whom this would be like death by paper cut. So we know that it will probably make you uncomfortable. And certainly some of these terms, by the way they sound, are off-putting. But the discomfort you might feel in a couple of conversations is parallel to what African Americans or others might feel on an ongoing basis, whether they're bird watching, whether they're sitting in their house eating ice cream. What might be an uncomfortable situation for you for a few moments may actually be a life and death situation for others. So it's worth getting through that discomfort. But let's start with the term race itself. So race is actually a social construct created to establish hierarchies about who gets access to what resources. Humans have devised ways to delineate differences between self and other for millennia. We've done this through religion, through tribe, through caste, through extended family surnames. Just think back to Game of Thrones, not too long ago. You saw people who were largely the same race fighting each other for territory, for power, for turf. You might see conflict among Tutsis and Hutus in Rwanda. They appear to be the same race, but they're having this kind of conflict because they've created boundaries based on different methods. And race is something that really took hold in the 18th century as Europe sought to colonize other parts of the globe to increase their wealth. And they wanted methods for categorizing and sorting people. So it's important to keep the conversations about racism as a way of looking at this larger system of categorizing and sorting people by one particular method. Now, racism itself is not just a singular event or a singular incident. And that's why you'll hear a lot of people refer to systemic racism. It's actually collective acts that reinforce and build upon one another through laws, through policies, through unspoken rules and practices that drive resources towards some people and away from others by virtue of race. And yes, people of color can carry prejudices and anger and dislike against others, but racism is very much about creating hierarchies in order to secure control and power. So let's take housing, for example. Housing is a really good example. The city of Tempe, once upon a time, was a sundown town, and those are places where Blacks were not allowed to be after sunset. Racial covenants, housing laws prevented Blacks from living into the city until the fair housing laws were passed in the 1960s. Now, as many of you know, housing is one of those key ways that people are able to pass wealth on to their families. But governments, meaning the federal government, as well as local governments around the country, lending agencies, realtors, homeowners associations, neighborhood associations, they all contributed in their way in the past to ensure segregation. Today, some practices like limiting what homes are shown to Black home buyers perpetuate some of these practices in the past. But because of this, African Americans will have a much harder time catching up in the realm of accumulated wealth that makes some of the homes in more affluent neighborhoods out of their reach. So when you sit and look around your neighborhood and think, well, I live in a neighborhood of all white people, all of my neighbors are, or most of my neighbors are white, that didn't happen just by happenstance. It didn't naturally happen that all the white people went to live in one place and all the blacks went to live in another place. In fact, many of the places that blacks and other people of color were required to live in by law were places that had lots of pollution, had no access to good transportation to get to good jobs, and they certainly didn't have good schools. So by you living in a nice house in a nice affluent neighborhood, without knowing it, you're actually participating in a long-term racist system. Implicit bias. So implicit bias is when people act on unconscious negative attitudes or stereotypes or impressions about a group of people. When it comes to African Americans, it often results in non-Black people associating them with higher levels of criminality, or untrustworthiness. When you take a look at the images of those many Black men who have been killed by police, you'll notice that many of them are darker skinned. In these situations, officers are often acting on impulsive fear, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, but it's a fear that these men are naturally more dangerous than other men. And also, because of the color of their skin, their lives are less valuable, and therefore the repercussions for such an act of violence against them will be lower. Now, this concept actually ties to something called colorism, which again takes this idea of how we sort and categorize and create hierarchies to a global human level. And it's this idea that people with lighter skin and pale eyes are not just more beautiful, but they're also safer, they're more trustworthy, they're more valuable. And so people with white skin are placed on the top of this hierarchy. Latin America, Europe, Asia, even parts of Africa all still have their own versions of this. And we can see it in popular culture, especially in music videos. And when it comes to Black people in the United States, color was always a demarcation of lesser status, especially since the laws about slavery had to do with the color of your skin and having African ancestry. Many Black people today know what the one drop rule means, is that you might be able to pass for white, but if you have one drop of Blackness in you, that actually makes you Black. And that actually makes you, in the past, subject to all of the rules that surround Black people versus white people. Now, all of those things, like I mentioned, that hierarchy, it lends to a kind of privilege. And privilege, when it comes to conversations of race, white privilege in particular, can be defined in many different ways. It can simply mean the freedom to exist without suspicion. Like, can you walk into a high-end store and have people approach you because they want to help you buy something, not because they're worried that you might steal something or that you don't belong? Or can you drive home from a party at night and go 10 miles over the speeding limit and not be afraid of being stopped by the police and having something bad happen to you? So privilege doesn't mean that you haven't struggled. It doesn't mean that you haven't worked hard. It doesn't mean that you haven't had a difficult life. All of those things can be possible. But it might mean that you have been considered smarter, more trustworthy, or more beautiful by virtue of your skin, your hair, and your eye color than someone else. And someone has tacitly given you advantages. They might have even not been aware that they have done that, but they've given you this advantage over someone who has darker skin. We know that when it comes to men in presidential debates, quite often, since presidential debates have been televised, the taller man often wins the debate. Privilege is like that. When it comes to crime and punishment, with African Americans, darker skinned African Americans face longer sentences. Darker skinned students are more likely to be expelled from school. So this isn't just a preference about taste and about what you might think is pretty. It's actually something that creates, like I said, a life and death situation for someone as they move forward in life. In the past, when segregation was legal, white people knew that they had this special place, this higher place in American society, regardless of their class status or their wealth. But once these laws surrounding segregation disappeared or were removed, and it became socially less acceptable to be identified as racist, that is when those advantages became hidden, and many white people began to deny that they ever even existed. So that is what people refer to today when they talk about white privilege. It's moving through the world without knowing that your appearance gives you certain advantages. Now, another hard one is white fragility. Author Robin DiAngelo coined this term fairly recently, and she is white and she grew up poor, and she likes to explain that she had certain advantages by being white that she knew that other poor people of different colors didn't have. And so I totally get why this word makes people want to shut their ears, but it's really worth listening to her and hearing her out. Because white fragility isn't about it's not about white people being weak. White people are clearly strong and capable human beings. It's just that when it comes to talking about race, people take it personally. It's as if this group examination, like examining what is happening among the whole group, will somehow reveal that they themselves are a bad person. So this term speaks to the denial that many white Americans have about the fact that our society was founded in unequal ways, and that inequality still exists today. So it's a fear of examining the beliefs that they might hold within themselves. You know, many people might say, how can I be racist when my best friend or my significant other is Black or Latinx or Asian? Yes, you can still be part of a system that elevates and values your life more than it does the person you love or the children you give birth to. So white supremacy. Now, white supremacy is another tough one, but I think we all know what it looks like. It's that authoritarianism. It's that idea of maintaining sameness, that this sameness has to do with being white, meaning of Northern European descent. And it's this idea that people from that region of the globe are superior inherently to all other classifications of human beings, but especially those of African descent. And with white supremacy comes this extreme dehumanization of other people, especially Africans. And it's with that the kind of cruelty that we saw during slavery, during the colonization of the Congo, the colonization of South Africa and other parts of the world, that's when that cruelty became possible. In modern times, white supremacy is most clearly coalesced under Nazi Germany, and it persists throughout Europe and the nations colonized by Europeans, including us. And many of you know what it looks like. You've seen it, you've felt it. But there's another term related to it called white superiority. And this is, I'd say, white supremacy's less outspoken cousin. It's when the beliefs are not as extreme, but there's still this idea that white people are somehow better than others and should therefore be treated better, even if that sense of unconscious bias is not aware to the person having the thought. They may not know why they should be treated better. They just know it, they feel it, and they move through the world as if everyone else should be treating them better. So I'm gonna stop because that's enough terms, and that's a lot to digest. And I know that many of you want to say, let's just love each other and see no color and look forward into the future. And optimism and future thinking is ingrained in American culture. We try to be an ahistorical society. We try to be a society that doesn't look into the past. But to be honest, that's kind of like being an adult who underwent some severe childhood trauma. And you don't face that trauma, but you're wondering why you have insurmountable depression or addictions or negative patterns that you just can't break. Now multiply that times millions. Let's try 300 million. If we really want to be the home of the free and the land of equality in the future, we have to face our past one conversation at a time. Thank you.
Kinja, thank you. Thank you so much for weaving such a rich tapestry for us for taking us everywhere from slavery to Latin America to Game of Thrones and Wakanda with such deep and meaningful understanding. You even took us to a 2.0 level of colorism and superiority, and I thank you for that. Really, Kinja, what you provided us was the ability to dig deeper in these conversations, not just on the surface, but to have meaningful conversations and to look and explore some of the concepts and the terms that you provided us and have that as the foundation of the good work to be free and truly equal in America. Thank you, Kinja.
Thank you.
Okay, well, James, thank you so much for being our final presenter today. I'm so excited to have you with this team and with this group making meaningful change and giving the city a great resource and toolkit to use in understanding and having these difficult conversations on race. We heard already from Colleen what it means to practice, practice, practice to have these conversations. And then we heard from Kinja, and she gave us the terms and history around the words that we often hear in these conversations. So now let's move to you. Let's actually move to the heart. What can we do in terms of allyship and the resources that we use? What's next, right? So the question that I pose to you, James, is what more can listeners do to go deeper in understanding and to be a part of the change that we want to see in our city?
Let me start by thanking everyone involved for the invitation to speak today. These kinds of conversations, hard conversations about race and racism, are sorely needed. And I'm honored to contribute to this project in some small way. I've been asked to say a few things today about allyship, and I want to be clear at the outset that I do not pretend to be offering anything authoritative. I am not trying to lay out what allyship is or should be at all times in all cases. To attempt to do so would be impossible. Allyship is not a state. It is not an identity one crafts, a title one attains, or some discrete set of processes or actions one studies and masters. Allyship is an activity. It's something we're constantly working to do. It's dynamic and ever-changing. To attempt to define allyship once and for all would be arrogant, it would be unethical, and it would be dangerous. I cannot provide a singular definition of allyship, nor can I tell you precisely what it looks like. However, I can offer some thoughts on allyship informed by my own experience, both as an individual and as a faculty fellow in the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at Arizona State University. To do so, I want to provide what I think is a useful list of 4 do's and don'ts. First, do treat others the way they want to be treated. Don't treat others the way you want to be treated. This first do and don't might seem counterintuitive. Many of us, myself included, were raised with some version of the golden rule instilled in us by our parents, teachers, and mentors. Of course, the problem is that treating others the way we want to be treated puts us at the center. It measures all things through our own experiences and assumes that everyone else wants to or should want to be like us. Treat others the way you want to be treated is a maxim that might seem altruistic on the surface, but is rooted in something other than altruism. Treating others the way we want to be treated is self-centered. Treating others the way they want to be treated reverses this self-centeredness. It forces us beyond our own perceptions of the world, beyond the default assumption that others can and should share our values. It asks us to attend to others as people, with their own feelings, histories, beliefs, fears, joys, and hopes. In a real way, every other do and don't I'm sharing with you today stems from this first one. Number 2, do shut up and listen. Don't stay quiet. This second set of do's and don'ts might seem something of a paradox. How can I both shut up and not stay quiet? The key to unpacking this seeming paradox is context. One of the first things we must do if we take the call to allyship seriously is shut up and listen. We, and here I'm especially thinking of well-meaning white folks, seem to have an almost uncontrollable urge to speak first and ask questions later. We try to speak on behalf of others or speak for others. We speak the way we would want others to speak for or on behalf of us, and in the progress, forget that our understanding of the world is radically limited. We try to give voice to the voiceless, ignoring that the ostensibly voiceless are speaking loud and clear, if we are just willing to listen. Listening, it turns out, is often much more productive than speaking. We can and must listen to our friends and colleagues, to acquaintances and strangers, and even to those with whom we disagree. We can and must listen to conversations in our day-to-day lives, to dialogues in the larger world, and to the words of authors living and dead who call us to understandings we could not have glimpsed otherwise. Let me be clear. Listening like this does not mean that we should fall into the trap of asking the people of color in our lives what it's like to live in their shoes or what we should be doing to be good allies. Allyship is not the responsibility of others. It is the responsibility of the ally. What it does mean, however, is that we should take time before we say or do anything to shut up and listen to what has been said and is being said. Allyship also requires that we speak, and more pointedly, that we speak when it is hard or costly to do so. A friend of mine has often said that white folk need to talk to white folk about race and racism, and she's right. As allies, we need to be prepared to have the tough conversations around the dinner table, at our churches, and in our communities. Allyship means that we have to be willing to call out racism, sexism, xenophobia, and every other evil when we see it, even when we see it among our friends, families, and colleagues. This kind of speaking is not easy to do, and the costs of doing so can be high. But that's the commitment we have to make. Number 3, do work in the service of others. Don't try to save others. This third of our do's and don'ts might be stated this way. It's not about you. If we strive towards real allyship and not simply performative allyship, if we strive to be a part of change in ways that leverage privilege to ensure the safety, security, and prosperity of those who lack that same privilege, then we need to recognize that the focus of our actions must be outside of ourselves. If we find ourselves acting to be seen or hashtagging for likes, then we've missed the point. We've also missed the point if we believe that we, as allies, are going to help them. I've been part of too many conversations, especially recently, where the focus of what I am sure are well-meaning folks of privilege is on the ways to help them. I hear things like, we need to be their voice, or we need to go into those communities and provide the opportunities they don't have. This isn't allyship. This is confusing allyship with the desire to be a white savior. The fourth do and don't. Do own up to your mistakes and accept that you will make them. If you're worried you just missed something in what I said, don't be. This last do is a do without a don't. We have to recognize that allyship is hard and complicated work, requiring constant vigilance and a great deal of humility. It also requires that we accept both that we will screw up and that we need to be ready to be held to account when we do. I'm going to be honest with you. While I do my best to walk the walk I've been talking today, I failed to do so as often as I have succeeded. It's likely I've even made some mistakes in what I'm saying right now. Let me be more direct. I've all too often been self-centered, myopic, and frankly, a bad ally. Sometimes these failures have stemmed from ignorance, sometimes from complacency, and sometimes from arrogance. And while I will do my utmost to be better moving forward, I have to know that I'm going to continue to make mistakes. We all are. We have to be ready and willing to own up to those inevitable failures. Further, we have to be prepared to do so without attempting to provide rationalizations, justifications, or excuses. As I said at the outset of my time today, I do not want to suggest that I've provided or can provide a precise definition of what allyship is or how an ally ought to act or think. What I hope I have done is provide some early thoughts on allyship that make clear both that it is an activity, that is a never-ending process requiring constant reflection, and that help to spur your own thinking about how you can be an ally moving forward. We find ourselves in troubled and troubling times, in a world in crisis. And while this crisis is not new, racism has been a part of the American experience since at the beginning, a white supremacist defect in the DNA of our union. There does seem to be a renewed feeling of hope that maybe we can bend this universe towards justice. It remains to be seen whether this moment is one in which real and lasting changes will be made. I hope it is. And if that's to be the case, then it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to labor for that end. I hope these thoughts have helped on that front. And again, thank you for inviting me to be part of this project.
James, thank you. Truly, thank you for those inspirational words and for that guidance. I think most importantly, I thank you for your honesty. You gave a very honest and very hard pill, which was the cost of allyship can be high. And to keep us within those parameters, but knowing that we together as allies can bend the universe towards justice. That's beautifully said. And most importantly, those 4 do's and don'ts, I love it. It's like everything you needed to know you learned in kindergarten, right? But most importantly, James, what you gave us was how we can unlearn and learn new ways to interact with, learn from, and support each other. And for that, we are very grateful. Thank you. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen, Kinja, and James for guiding us on this journey. You have provided us with a roadmap we can all use in the days and months ahead. Yes, it will be tough. Yes, we will make mistakes. But simply beginning those conversations and creating those tiny moments is the spark that leads to deepened unity in our city and in our world. Well, you've been given lots of tools today. Let's not forget James's do's and don'ts and Colleen's references to interviews and books. Those resources can be found just over my shoulder. Interviews named were Listen, Learn, Act, conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion. Also, Race in America. The books that were mentioned were How to Be an Anti-Racist, Me and White Supremacy, and then White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. We certainly hope you enjoyed learning and growing with us today. You can access this session on these websites and social media sites. Then watch and share it as many times as you'd like. So on behalf of Tech Data, Arizona State University, and the City of Tempe, thank you for joining us, and let's get talking.